Hi, classes. This is take two. That's my issue, not yours, of day 13 of our Civil Rights Unit, intended for Wednesday, April 29th. A few reminders. We had our first grade of the fourth quarter on Monday. Uh, keep watching every day, tuning in every day. We're going to have, lecture, assignment, etc., Monday through Friday posted here. Uh, in addition, everything that we did in the third quarter was hold harmless, meaning again, it could not, it could only help your grade, not hurt your grade. In the fourth quarter, if you have access, unless you've reached out to me or your principal and said, I just don't have regular access, then, and we have an alternative solution for those students, then this work counts much more in a traditional quarter. So keep up with your work. In addition to that, even though some of the assignments then that we did for this unit were hold harmless because they were in the third quarter, there still is going to be a test next week on the civil rights unit, unit 10 and 11. It's going to be sent to you in a form. You're going to have more notice. I'll give you a specific day when I know that day. And you obviously, when you're sent this form, are going to have the ability to look things up. I know that. I'm not that dumb. That's what I would do too. But it's going to be timed. It's going to be 45 minutes. So you have to have your notes organized so that you would have a chance to look up something, particularly cases and things like that. Otherwise, if you just try to look up everything cold, you are going to run out of time well before it is due. And then once that 45 minutes is up, I'm going to close out that form so it will no longer accept responses. So you've got to be ready. And part of that is keeping up on all of these lectures. They're not full class periods. When you're in school, it's 42 to 45 minutes. These have been roughly, if you count the work and the lectures, 30 minutes put together. So you can go through this pretty quickly. Remember also to do the formatives. There's going to be a formative today for yesterday's work on the women's rights movement. Those are not graded. Uh, those are always for your feedback, and they tell me where you are, and then they should give you an idea of what sorts of questions I'm going to be asking on the test because many of your test questions are pulled right from those. So let's get into it today. We should have, I'm going to guess, 15 minutes worth of notes today. And today we're going to talk about who stood up for Hispanic Americans and Native Americans, the groups and what the letters stood for. But in reality, we're only going to do about half of this objective. We're going to talk about Hispanic Americans today. And tomorrow we'll talk about Native Americans. So Hispanic American protest is our topic, our focus. And let's get into a few definitions so we understand what we're talking about. So Hispanic Americans, according to basically the US Census, is made up of anybody from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or any other Central or South American nation. We lump together very distinct cultures and say, oh, they're all Hispanic. Now, we do this for a logical reason. There are some things that are shared, but it should be noted. These are very different cultures. Um, my roommate in college happened to be of Mexican descent, and he took great offense to sometimes that term being thrown around too much Hispanic because he was like, well, listen, Mexican food is very different from Cuban food. And again, food's only one aspect of culture, but a pretty common one. And he would say, listen, do not mix these up. Uh, my oldest son, for a long time, dated a young lady who happened to be of Puerto Rican descent, and we shared many meals, and it's very different as far as the food goes, and they're very good friends today. I personally did not. I don't want to offend anybody. I'm a picky eater. Did not particularly like that food nearly as much as I like traditional Mexican food. But that's just again one example. So why then do we lump all of these different groups together and say, boom, you're Hispanic? Well, there are some things that are shared, and that's the Spanish language and Catholic religion. Now, not everywhere, not absolutely 100%, but the Spanish language is spoken by the overwhelming majority of people we lump together as Hispanic Americans, and the Catholic religion, by some measures, is 85 to 90% of those nationalities as well. So that's why we're lumping them together culturally. They are different. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. Ecuador has a different cultural vibe and feel and food and everything else that makes up culture than Mexico. Uh, Not putting any value on one being better than the other, just different. Um, but again, because so many share that Spanish language and Catholic religion, we have a tendency in the United States to lump them together. Kind of view it like this. this is everything that would be the Mexican culture, Cuban culture outside of that. And there's going to be some things that overlap maybe between these groups, but not this group. What's here in the middle, what overlaps between all of them, is mostly the Catholic religion and the Spanish language. So that's why we're going to talk about some of their needs and desires in this time period together. They were and are the fastest growing minority in the United States. Now, so much so that many projections show that Hispanic Americans may no longer be a minority by 2050. Now, those are projections. You never know how those will work out. But let's get right down to the definition of minority. A group is a minority group if, by definition, they are less than the majority. So, right now, the majority of Americans are Caucasian and have been for quite some time. But by 2050, Caucasians would become a minority, and Hispanic Americans would be the majority. That's what those projections are saying. Uh, if we look at a map of the United States, you could see that this immigration trend is stronger in some areas. Hispanic population by a percentage of that state. You can see in these states that are dark blue, light blue, a little bit lesser extent, you have large 25% or more of their population being Hispanic American. And this, again, makes sense due to the proximity to Mexico, for example. So, this is a pretty big group that we are talking about. And there are some issues that were shared by these groups. Now, you may not agree that some of these issues are a concern, and that's fine. It's not my job to have you have a judgment on that or judge your judgment. I'm just sharing with you what some of their concerns were. And one of the early ones was that there were undocumented immigrants in our country and they were unable to receive social services. Now, I think a lot of people would initially say, well, I don't care if somebody who's here illegally from whatever country has social services. They wouldn't think, common sense wouldn't think, make you think that you would deserve them. But in reality, you do have even illegal immigrants who paying taxes. So as an illegal immigrant, maybe you don't pay an income tax, but you certainly would pay sales tax, for example. Pay sales tax on virtually everything you buy but food. There are taxes you pay on things like gas. Just there's a lot of embedded taxes in our economy, and if you're paying into those, whether here legally or illegally, some feel that then you should have access to some of the benefits of those taxes. I'll leave that to your discretion. I think a bigger issue for the individual we're going to talk about today was the exploitation of many Hispanic Americans as farm laborers. So, in particular, in the Southwest, where I showed you on that map where we have larger Hispanic populations, what you had in the Southwest was many, and it's not exclusively to there, it's more common in the Southwest, many farms, particularly really large farms, corporation farms, that were hiring undocumented immigrants on purpose because they would pay them often half of minimum wage. And they figured that people who were here illegally would never basically report these companies for paying less than minimum wage because the people that were getting paid that were illegally here. And so they were often exploited as farm laborers. Now, in addition, some were here legally and paid less than minimum wage. And unfortunately, some of these corporations thought that people were so new to the country that they wouldn't know that they had certain rights. And so, really, the exploitation was awful. Uh, in addition, you had, particularly as the movement gained strength, a fight for bilingual education. That is the use of two languages in education. We can debate all day long whether or not people should be required to speak the language when they come to the country. Although I will say our country has a long history of people speaking other languages, and then their children often then speak English. And by the way, the children of immigrants are often the most entrenched in bilingual processes. The idea that I've had students come in and interpret for their parents and the speed at which they can convert and go back and forth speaking in the cases that I've had Spanish and English, it just amazes me. And that's sort of what happens when you're immersed into the culture like that. But if you do not initially know English when you come to the United States, you may feel strongly that people should be able to speak it, but set that aside. Then how would you learn that English? What the Hispanic movement is going to say, eventually through a group I'll tell you about in a second, is that the only way to properly learn a language is, at least at the beginning, to speak the native tongue of the person trying to use that language. So, in other words, if you are, look, I'll take somebody from here. I'll move one of you to Russia. Now imagine you've moved to Russia, and we're going to say, nope, this is where you live now. Your parents moved. It's out of your control. You now have to learn. You have to learn math or science in Russia, but it's only being taught to you in Russian. That would be incredibly difficult for you to overcome. You would have to at least be taught to some degree in English first before it would become, possible for you to be immersed in the language enough. The United States is sort of infamous throughout the world for believing everybody else should just speak English when we're actually pretty awful at speaking other languages ourselves. Um, One of the things you'll see a lot of scholars say is that we need to push down when we speak, when we teach other languages to our students. I took Spanish 1 and 2. I think my junior and senior year, or sophomore and junior year. Oh man, it was really tough for me and really late for me, and it's not my strength anyway. So if you can imagine, you see some schools push that down now into kindergarten or first grade, and man, kids pick it up really quick. It's much more logical, no matter what languages you're trying to teach. Regardless, this group, like everybody else, like all these other groups we've discussed, is going to find out that forming an organization is going to help spearhead the effort and organize the effort for these issues. Cesar Chavez is going to emerge as the sort of unofficial leader of the Hispanic civil rights movement, very much like Dr. King was the unofficial leader of the African American civil rights movement. Cesar Chavez is, let me see here, we'll go here. Cesar Chavez is often likened as the sort of Hispanic Dr. King. Um, Cesar Chavez was intricately tied into the United Farm Workers, which I'll get to in a second, a contemporary of Dr. King, and absolutely, with Dr. King's blessing, used many of the techniques, in particular the boycott, more than anything else. But Cesar Chavez, again, very much at the heart of the Hispanic American rights movement. You can see in this picture here, actually, this is a color version of this same picture and zoomed in a little bit. He's got a large picture of Gandhi, who was a major influence on Dr. King, and then a large picture of Bobby Kennedy, who he fought very hard to help him get the Democratic nomination in 1968. As a matter of fact, the co-founder of the United Farm Workers was there in the kitchen when Bobby Kennedy was killed. So Cesar Chavez is a major player in what's called the United Farm Workers. Now, the United Farm Workers starts off really more like a union. And then because they represent so many Hispanic Americans, they end up becoming a civil rights organization. I mean, it might sound weird, United Farm Workers. Not every Hispanic American, obviously, is involved in agriculture. It just sort of evolved that way that they became a civil rights organization at the same time. Cesar Chavez's initial concerns were definitely about the exploitation of farm laborers, about fighting for a fair wage and fair treatment, and then evolved to things like bilingual education and social services. The United Farm Workers still exists today. This is their official page right now, and just like now, I want to go to these pages and show you that this is living history. These groups still exist. They were formed in this era, but they still exist. And just scrolling through this, it looks like there's a great concern, and this makes sense, about coronavirus and how are we protecting agricultural workers in terms of coronavirus. Makes sense. It would make sense. That's a timely issue for an organization like this to take on. And so, again, you can visit that United Farm Workers, still very active today. In the 60s and 70s, when it was really gaining strength, what you saw was often using the boycott to fight for better pay and better working conditions. Uh, in particular, grapes come to mind. There was a very successful boycott against large producers of grapes and people who were using grapes to make wine. And Cesar Chavez, borrowing techniques from Dr. King, used publicity to push the idea that please boycott grapes, don't buy grapes, don't buy wine from these certain manufacturers because they don't pay a fair or living wage for these workers. And it worked. The economic pressure from that forced many of these large uh, agribusinesses, big industrial farms, to go ahead and make some changes over time. 1965 Immigration Act is also a big victory. There was, before 1965, immigration was still based to some degree on a percentage of how many people were already here. And that did not reflect, for example, a large percentage are from German or Irish heritage. That did not reflect the demand where, people were clamoring to get into the United States from. And the 1965 Immigration Act opened up, it abolished these old quotas and opened up immigration in a much more just who wants to come in kind of way. And that's when you see this huge increase in the number of immigrants from Latin America. There's a pretty big increase from Asia and Africa as well, particularly Asia, but really, really big increase in Hispanic American immigration. And that's a major shift. In other words, if you go way back in our notes, right around 1880, we had a shift, our first major shift. Before 1880, the majority of our immigrants were coming from Northern and Western Europe, places like, Ireland. And then after 1880, you have really a shift. And again, these are trends, not exclusives, but you had a shift to Southern and Eastern Europeans. So, maybe Russia or Poland or things like that. So you had this big shift in 1880, and that kind of stays true all the way until 1965. And ever since 1965, the overwhelming majority of our immigrant push has been from Latin America, has been Hispanic Americans. And so again, that makes all of these issues that more pertinent then because this is such a large, important group. I will finish up the notes on this one notion that I had from a professor that spoke 7 languages, which was incredibly impressive. Actually, he was a teaching assistant, but he was the guy teaching this college class. Uh, and he once showed several of us, so I'm stealing this from him. Oh, I wish you hadn't seen that. Oh, you already saw it. Uh, the idea of giddy, and he put this on the board. And he had us basically what he said was his native tongue was an African dialect, and I can't remember which one off the top of my head. And then he was formally schooled in a couple other languages, and then from there he was able to teach himself some other languages, the Romance languages in particular. And he said the two that you just can't teach yourself, at least without great insane effort compared to the others, were Chinese and English. And the reason is many of these other languages have a set thing of rules that they follow just very, very strictly. English and Chinese apparently do not. And I have no idea about Chinese, but certainly I understand his point here with English. Because what he said was he used to be able to take some words and he could piece some things together. So when he knew Spanish and was trying to learn French, he could take some of these rules that he knew and take some of these words and go, okay, if this word makes this sound, I can sound this out. And he put up this word to demonstrate to us why it doesn't work in English and why it's so hard to learn. So he asked us what we thought this was, and most of us said something along the lines of giddy. Uh, Basically, giddy was the most common pronunciation. And he said, no, 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 this was me trying to spell fish. We thought he was crazy. But then he said, well, look at it like this. You take the word cough, and you know that GH sound at the end makes that sound. He had right. And then you take a word like vacation, and he said, I knew that TI sound made that sh sound. So to him, the GH, I, and TI made the sound fish. But man, that's nothing like fish. And he said, that's exactly why your language makes no sense. And that's why it's so difficult. And so it's an entertaining point. I think that that's pretty logical and it explains why English can be so hard, in particular to uh, be able to write out for so many people. Okay, so that cleans up the notes for today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Native American protests. Make sure you have these notes. And again, you know the big points for that and get that formative review done about women's rights because I don't want you to forget about that material and you should see what sorts of questions will be about women's rights on the next test. Okay? Stay safe, everybody.